So in the last segment, I had said that in this segment we'd talk about Kant, Quine, and also why a realist modal ontology is preferable to a mentalist modal ontology. I think I'll leave Kant and Quine for next time, and in this segment we'll just talk about why a realist modal ontology is preferable to a mentalist modal ontology. And the discussion will focus on what are called persistence conditions and individuation conditions. And here's the rough idea. In order to have genuine persistence conditions and individuation conditions, we need a realist modal ontology. We want genuine persistence conditions and individuation conditions, and that's why a realist modal ontology is preferable to a mentalist modal ontology. Now, what are persistence conditions? They're just the conditions that are required for something to persist. So presumably, I'm the same person who started teaching this course several weeks ago. You're the same people who started attending this course several weeks ago. In order for me to be the same person that started the course and you to be the same people that started the course, there need to be persistence conditions. That is, conditions that such that if they're not met, you don't persist, and such that if they are met, you do persist. Okay, so let's look at an example. Here at time 1, we have an object, and someone comes along and names that object. Now, they're not naming the kind, they're naming the individual. So they're not naming the kind cinder block such that a different cinder block would also count as Cindy. Rather, this person is naming the individual cinder block. He's naming the cinder block Cindy. Now here's an argument. Cindy has no necessary properties, and that's an assumption for the sake of reductio. Remember, we talked about the argument form reductio ad absurdum before. The way reductio ad absurdum works is you assume some claim to be true, and then you see what the consequences of that assumption are. If a consequence of that assumption is a contradiction, then the assumption must be false, since contradictions can't be true. So we're assuming for the sake of reductio that Cindy has no necessary properties. And now at time 2, there's a variety of different objects here. We have another, what appears to be the same cinder block. We have some cinder block dust. We have a bit of a hillside, a mountainside, and we have a fish, specifically a rock mover wrasse. And now the question is, which of these objects at time 2 counts as Cindy? Now you might want to know more, you might want to know what's the causal history of the objects, and let's just stipulate that the object on top in column 2, under time 2, that is the object that is a cinder block, is causally related to the object at time 1 in a way that none of the rest of the objects are. So it's sort of like occupying the same portion of space and so on. So here we have an assumption. Cindy has no necessary properties, and we have a bunch of objects at time 2. Here's the consequence of the fact that Cindy has no necessary properties. Since Cindy has no necessary properties, each of these time 2 objects has an equal claim to being Cindy. Now suppose you say, well, the rock mover wrasse can't be Cindy because Cindy is made of cement and the rock mover wrasse isn't. Sounds to me like you're saying there's some necessary property for being Cindy and the rock mover wrasse lacks that property. But you can't say that because by the assumption, Cindy has no necessary properties. Okay, so if Cindy has no necessary properties, then each of these time 2 objects has an equal claim to being Cindy. Well, it seems pretty obvious that the first of these time 2 objects has the strongest claim to being Cindy. Well, now we have our contradiction, right? 2 says each one has an equal claim, 3 says the first has the best claim, and that's a contradiction. So the way reductio ad absurdum works is, since our assumption led to a contradiction, we then reject our assumption. The assumption was that Cindy has no necessary properties, so we now conclude that Cindy has necessary properties. So this is an argument that we need necessity and possibility for persistence conditions, and persistence conditions is something we want. It's not an argument for a realist modal ontology in particular, or as opposed to a mentalist modal ontology. It's just an argument that we need necessity and possibility. But we can very easily iterate sort of something very similar to this argument and get the conclusion that we want a realist modal ontology. So here's how that goes. We're going to start with the same cinder block, and over comes someone and names it Cindy, and now we're going to have this as a premise. Let's suppose, as an assumption for reductio. Let's assume that how we think, and nothing else, that's what alone here means, how we think determines which properties are necessary for being Cindy. So we're assuming that we have a sort of mentalist ontology for persistence for individuals. And now at time 2, there's the same variety of objects. Once again, the top object here is causally connected to the object at time 1 in a way that the others aren't. Now, here's a consequence of the fact that how we think determines which properties are necessary for being Cindy. It follows that nothing in the world makes one of these time 2 objects a better candidate than another for being Cindy. When I say nothing in the world, what I mean is nothing in the mind-independent world. So the only thing, the idea is, that makes one of these objects a better candidate for being Cindy than another is that we think of things in a certain way. So that follows from 1, right? Since how we think determines which properties are necessary for being Cindy, how we think also determines which one of these time 2 objects is the best candidate for being the same individual as the time 1 object. Well, that just seems wrong. The first of these objects, the top one under time 2, is the most natural candidate for being Cindy. It's not natural simply because we think in a certain way. It's natural because that's the way the world is. There are individuals in the world that persist in the world or fail to persist in the world depending on what happens to them and regardless of how we think about things. Well, put these together, 2 and 3, and you get a contradiction. 2 says nothing outside of us makes one of these objects a better candidate than another for being Cindy, and 3 says the first of these objects is, independently of how we think about the world, the best candidate for being Cindy. And that's a contradiction. So we get the conclusion that how we think about the world does not determine which properties are necessary for being Cindy. And of course, if how we think about the world does not determine which of these properties are necessary for being Cindy, then we have a realist modal ontology. Okay, assuming that there are persistence conditions at all, we get a realist modal ontology. Okay, now you might point out that what the person is talking about when the person says Cindy depends on the person's intentions and what the person is thinking, and that's correct. That is, our language or thinking contributes some component to reference to what it is that we're talking about. The point here is the world has a role to play too. We could put it like this. If the person introduces the name Cindy to name the object that at time 1 is the cinder block and at time 2 is the cinder block, the person has introduced a name for a sort of natural individual. Whereas if the person introduces the name Cindy to name something that is a cinder block at time 1, but then a rock mover RAS at time 2, where that rock mover RAS isn't especially causally connected to the cinder block, then the person has picked out an unnatural individual. And so long as there are natural and unnatural individuals with persistence conditions, the idea goes, we need genuine necessary properties, and consequently we need a realist modal ontology. Now, let's iterate this again for individuation conditions. Individuation conditions allow us to individuate objects. That is to say that this object is one object and this is another. And here we're not going to look at individuation conditions for individual objects, but rather for kinds. So we want to say this object is a member of one kind and that object is a member of another kind. So we might point at a desk and say this object is a member of the kind desk. And we might point at a chalkboard and say this object is a member of the kind chalkboard. So here again, we're going to start with a cinder block. And now in column 1 here, there's going to be 2 columns, so I'm labeling this column 1. And along comes someone who says, look, a cinder block. And now this person isn't introducing the name cinder block to refer to this particular individual. Rather, this person is using the ordinary language term cinder block to refer to the kind being a cinder block, or the property being a cinder block. Now here's a premise, an assumption for the sake of reductio. Suppose that there are no properties that are necessary for being a cinder block. Well, here we have column 2. Now these are all at time 1 because we're not talking about persistence through time. We're talking about dividing things up at a single time. So there are no properties that are necessary for being a cinder block. It follows that each of the objects in column 2 has an equal claim to being the same kind of object as that in column 1, specifically to being a cinder block. Well, that's clearly false. The first of these objects in column 2 has the strongest claim to being the same kind of object as that in column 1. Well, since the assumption leads us to 2 and 3 is clearly true, we get a contradiction. 2 says each object in column 2 has equal claim to being the same as the kind as that in column 1, and 3 says the first has the best claim. Well, that's a contradiction. So since we got a contradiction, we go back, we reject our assumption. Our assumption was that there are no properties that are necessary for being a cinder block, so we get the conclusion that there are properties that are necessary for being a cinder block. Now, this tells us we need modality, we need necessity, but it doesn't tell us that we need a realist modal ontology in particular. But with this background in place, we can look at why we need a realist modal ontology in particular. So let's suppose, for the sake of reductio, that how we think alone, that is, how we think and nothing else, determines which properties are necessary for being a cinder block. It follows that nothing in the world, that is, nothing outside my mind, or our minds, gives one object in column 2 a better claim than another to being the same kind of object as that in column 1. So again, what this is saying is, if how we think alone determines which properties are necessary for being a cinder block, then nothing outside our minds gives one object in column 2 a better claim than another to being the same kind as the object in column 1. Well, clearly that's wrong, right? The first object in column 2 has better claim than any other in column 2 to being the same kind as the object in column 1. That is, put it more simply, the top object in column 2 has a better claim to being a cinder block than any of the other objects in column 2. Well, that's a contradiction, right? 2 and 3 contradict one another. So we have to accept the negation of the first claim, and the negation of the first claim is this. How we think does not determine which properties are necessary for being a cinder block. Well, the previous argument showed that there are necessary properties. Now we see that how we think doesn't determine what those necessary properties are. So we have to adopt a realist modal ontology and say something other than our thinking, way of speaking, determines what the necessary properties for being a cinder block are. Okay, so here's a summary of the general idea. A mentalist modal ontology implies a mentalist ontology for individuals and kinds, for persistence and individuation conditions for kinds. Persistence for individuals and individuation conditions for kinds. Put another way, realism about individuals or kinds implies a realist modal ontology. Well, you might be tempted to think that we impose modality on the world, that necessary properties and essences are bestowed by us, to use Elder's phrase. But you're probably not tempted to think that which individuals and kinds there are is entirely up to us. That is, it's not especially tempting to think that which individuals actually exist, like whether you exist or I exist or this computer that I'm looking at right now or the device that you're looking at right now exists. It's not plausible that that's up to us. And it's not plausible that whether there are computers is up to us and whether there are people is up to us. It's much more plausible that these things exist independently of how we conceptualize the world and talk about the world. So the idea goes, since mentalism about modality implies mentalism in general, that is about individuals and kinds, and mentalism about individuals and kinds is highly implausible, it follows that a mentalist modal ontology is implausible, and correspondingly that a realist modal ontology is plausible. And that's why a realist modal ontology is more desirable than a mentalist modal ontology. Okay, we'll stop this segment there and turn to Kant and Quine next time.